Hi, it's Dr. Michael Ling, and in this video, I'm going to talk about a three-step formula that any dentist or any dental staff member can use to present any type of case to your patient. So how many times does it happen to you where you present a case to a patient and you get the typical response, I'll think about it, wow, that's really expensive, let me just go home and sleep on it, or do we really have to do that now, or I think I'll just leave it. Or the worst is when the patient accuses us of needing to make our next boat payment or college tuition payment. This is millions of dollars lost every time a patient says no to your treatment. Now, it's not realistic that every patient is going to say yes every single time, but I think it's worthwhile to spend at least a little bit of time, a little bit of effort trying to improve your communication skills to get a higher percent of patients to say yes. And in my experience, when a patient says, I'll think about it, oftentimes it's a little white lie. They don't want to tell us the truth. And the truth is that they're saying, no thanks, I'm not interested. And because you as the dentist don't know the real truth, all you can do is try again next time. And this is when dentists start to get the reputation as being pushy and salesy and constantly talking about the same treatment over and over again that the patient just doesn't care about. And what happens from the dentist's point of view when you keep getting rejected? You start to feel bad about yourself. You don't want that reputation of being salesy and pushy. You start becoming afraid of overwhelming your patient. So then you start to compromise. You're afraid to talk about comprehensive treatment. So then you start to think, well, I'll just talk about these one or two teeth today instead of talking about all the teeth that I know need treatment. Or we start watching things that we know really should be treated today. And it's all because we're afraid of rejection, of being perceived as pushy and salesy, because that's the last thing we want to do. If you're taking the time to watch this video, then I think it's safe to assume that you truly want what's best for your patients. You take your job seriously and you want to get better. And I'm going to show you a very simple three-step framework that allows you to not only increase case acceptance, but also increase patient satisfaction. Patients say yes more often, and they're also way happier with this style of communication. Whether they accept $0, $50, or $50,000 worth of treatment. And it all comes down to how you present the treatment, what words you use, and what order you use those words in. So how do most dentists present treatment to patients? Well, most dentists I see have no plan at all. They just wing it. They've developed some analogies over the years. They talk about cracks in a windshield. But there really is no plan. There's no thought behind these words. It's just what they've always done and what they're comfortable with. Most dentists I know are also afraid of discussing money with the patient. The conventional wisdom is that the dentist should never be the one discussing treatment. We should leave that to our treatment coordinators or to our front desk people. But I'm going to show you in this video why, if you, the dentist, are not discussing finances with your patient, you're killing your case acceptance. Dentists are also notorious for overwhelming their patient with too many options. And I know this is true because I get patients all the time that come from other dentists that say they went to that dentist for help and they left that office way more confused than when they went in. The dentist overwhelmed them with technical jargon, way too many details, way too many options, and not enough simplicity and clarity. And lastly, we dentists tend to think like scientists and engineers, and we think that educating the patient more will get them to say yes. But it's not lack of knowledge that holds people back from going ahead with treatment. It's lack of clarity and simplicity and lack of context with your treatment plan. And I'm going to show you how to overcome all these problems in our three-step formula. And here's how the formula works. There's three phrases that you have to memorize. Here's what's happening, what I'm worried about is, and the good news is. It's as simple as that. If you can memorize these three phrases, your case acceptance is going to be much more simple, clear, and effective. So what's the point of these three phrases? First of all, these are the exact phrases that I use in my practice to train all of our doctors and our staff. It's crazy to me how you can hire somebody off the street to work in your practice and give them no training in how to talk about your solutions to patients. This is like a car dealer hiring a car salesman and then not teaching that car salesman anything about the cars that they sell, or how to talk about them, or what features are important, and how their cars compare to their competitors. Or it's like owning a restaurant and hiring a server and then not training that server on the menu item. It's absolutely insane, but we do it all the time in dentistry. We hire people to work in our office and then give them zero training in how to talk about our services and solutions. So this three-step formula is simple enough that all dentists and all staff members should be able to memorize 3 phrases to make patient communication more effective and more consistent. This 3-step formula also takes advantage of the anchoring principle, which we talk a lot about in Practice on Fire and we'll briefly touch on in this video. And lastly, not only does this framework increase case acceptance, but like I said before, patients are much happier. We get comments from patients all the time, from the ones that accept $0 to the ones that accept $80,000, that they're so grateful that a dentist finally took the time to explain their options clearly. All they ever wanted was to be listened to and treated with respect. And part of treating our patients with respect is communicating to them effectively. This framework accomplishes all of these goals. Here's why it works. It takes advantage of the principle of anchoring. The anchoring principle says that your patient's perception of your treatment option is greatly influenced by the information that precedes that treatment option. To better understand how the anchoring principle works, let's look at some examples from outside of dentistry. First, did you ever notice that when you're looking at a display case in a jewelry store, how they usually have one giant piece of jewelry that's super, super expensive? And that super expensive piece is usually placed right in the center. And the jewelry store knows that hardly anybody is going to be able to afford that really expensive, massive diamond in the middle of the display. But the purpose of that super expensive piece of jewelry is to make all the other pieces around it feel less expensive. So if there's a diamond ring in the middle of the display case that costs $20,000, and then all of a sudden the other rings that only cost $10,000 feel like a much better value. Or how about when you take a trip to Disney World and your kids want to stand in line for one of the rides? If you go in blind and just get in a line without having any idea how long the line is, and the wait ends up being an hour long to get on the ride, you're probably pretty upset and impatient and frustrated by the time it's your turn to get on the ride. After all, you just waited an hour to get on this ride. But that's not what Disney does. Disney understands this, and they don't want you to be upset and stressed out and frustrated. So they don't let you get in the line blind. They post expected wait times. And if the actual wait time to get on the ride is an hour, they're probably going to post that the wait time is 90 minutes. So if you get in line thinking that the line is going to be 90 minutes, and then it ends up only being 60 minutes, all of a sudden, instead of being stressed and frustrated and impatient, you're happy, you're thrilled, you're excited that it was only 60 minutes. So in those two scenarios, the amount of time that you waited in line is exactly the same. You waited an hour. But in the second scenario, since you were anchored to 90-minute wait, the hour feels much shorter and you're much happier with that wait. How about when you go to a restaurant and they pass the terminal to you to add the tip? These days, I see the options are often things like 30%, 25%, 20%. And the reason why the restaurants do this is because they're anchoring you to a very high tip number. So if you see the options are 30, 25, 20, you're much less likely to hit the other button and type in 10% tip than if there was no anchor at all, and if the default tip amounts weren't so high at 30, 25, and 20%. The restaurant has anchored you to those high tip amounts because they want you to feel like that's normal. And it's going to influence you to tip more than you would have. So how do we take advantage of the anchoring principle in dentistry? It's very similar to these other examples. Before we present our preferred treatment option, we're going to first anchor that option to another option that's more expensive and less desirable. And here's the framework again. Here's what's happening, what I'm worried about is, and the good news is. Now let's show you some examples of how this works in clinical practice. And these are scenarios that you're probably going to run into 20 times this week alone. Here's a super simple example where you're doing a hygiene check and you find a patient with some interproximal class 2 decay on the bite wings. There's no symptoms, the patient has no idea what's going on. So rather than just blurt out, hey, Mrs. Jones, you have 5 cavities, you got to come back and fix those and it's going to cost you $1,500. In our practice, what we train our hygienists and our dentists to say is something like this, following the 3-step framework. So, Mrs. Jones, here's what's happening. You see those dark brown and black spots on your tooth and your x-ray? Those are cavities. What I'm worried about is, a lot of times these cavities get right into the nerve of the tooth. This is when people get toothaches and abscesses and end up needing root canals. If that happens, you and I would be spending a lot of time together, and it would cost you about $3,000 to fix. The good news is that your cavity isn't that bad yet. At this point, your nerve is still healthy, so we can skip the root canal and fix these with regular fillings. It will only take us about an hour and will cost you just $1,500. Does that sound like a plan? Here's another example where you have an emergency patient with a really bad toothache. You've diagnosed them with irreversible pulpitis and are about to treatment plan a root canal and a crown. Now you know that root canals have a stigma. If you just tell the patient that they need a root canal, they're probably going to be pretty upset, both because they're afraid of the procedure, but also because they're shocked at the cost. So instead of just saying to the patient, hey, Mrs. Jones, sorry about the bad news, you have an abscess, you need a root canal and a crown, here's what we would say instead, using the 3-step framework. First, so here's what's happening. You see this big hole in your tooth, that's a really big cavity, and that's what's keeping you up at night. The second phrase is what I'm worried about is a lot of times these cavities get so big that they completely destroy the tooth. Then the tooth needs to be extracted. And since this is one of your most valuable chewing molars, you'll probably end up replacing with an implant. In that case, you and I would be spending a lot of time together over the next year or so, and it would cost you about $6,000. It's really important that we're telling the patient how much time they're going to spend and how much money they're going to spend. And even after all that work, the new implant tooth you have won't be quite as good as the tooth in your mouth right now. So we've anchored the patient to a more expensive and less desirable outcome. The good news is that your cavity isn't that bad yet. At this point, your tooth is still fixable, so you can skip the extraction and the implant. We can fix this by fixing the infection and then protecting the tooth with a crown so it doesn't break in the future. We'll be done by end of the month, and it will cost you just $1,500. Does that sound like a good plan to you? So this is a great way to make something that is typically really bad news, needing a root canal and a crown, actually sound like pretty good news, because now the patient's thinking, wow, that's actually not that bad. At least I don't need the extraction and the implant. Another example that we run into all the time in our practice is the consult patient who's in your practice because they're interested in straightening their front teeth because they want a nicer smile. And in our minds, we know that they're a very good Invisalign patient. And most dentists will just start talking about how amazing Invisalign is, all the wonderful things it does. Here's some before and after pictures. Here's some brochures on the process and how great the plastic is. And then the patient will inevitably say, okay, it sounds great. I'm really interested, but how much is this going to cost? And then the dentist has to say, well, it's going to probably cost you in the range of $5,000. And now the patient who was super excited is now super bummed because they're thinking, well, that's great, but I have to pay $5,000. That's not great news. So how would we flip this around and make Invisalign sound like great news? It's simple. In this 3-step framework, we first anchor the Invisalign to another option that's more expensive and less desirable. And here's how I would do it. So here's what's happening. Same phrase that we start with all the time. In these photos and scans, how your front teeth are crooked because there's not enough space for them to line up straight. What I was worried about, second phrase, a lot of people I meet who ask about straightening their teeth also have major bite issues on their back teeth. In that case, I have to refer them to the orthodontist to get metal braces on their teeth. It works just fine, but tightening the metal wires every month can be really sore, and you'd have all that metal in your mouth for a year or two. So we've anchored them to a less desirable outcome, having metal brackets on their teeth, having monthly ortho checkups to tighten the wires, and a long treatment time of comprehensive ortho. What I forgot to add here, which is the most important part, is the cost of doing that. And so I'd also add a line, something like, and by the time you pay the orthodontist, it'll probably cost you in the range of $8,000. The good news is that your crowding is just in the front, and at this point in your life, there's not much benefit in trying to get your back teeth to bite together perfectly so it doesn't even bother you. That means you can skip the orthodontist and the metal braces, and you can get straight, white, beautiful teeth with Invisalign. They're super comfy and removable and invisible. Nobody will even know you're wearing them, and your new smile will be done in 6 months. And then the most important thing that I forgot in this slide is that it will only cost you $5,000. Does that sound like a good idea to you? So you can see how framing the Invisalign with these 3 steps makes that treatment feel like great news instead of bad news. A couple more clinical examples just to show you how versatile this 3-step process is and how you can use this framework virtually everywhere with patient communication. Do you ever have a patient in your perio program who says to you, the dentist, or your hygienist, something like, do I really need all these cleanings? Can't I just come once a year for my checkup? My insurance doesn't cover this and I don't really want to pay out of pocket. Well, this is how our hygienists are trained to handle this question. Instead of going on and on about plaque index and probing depths and bleeding points, all these things that the patients do not care about, what we would say is something like this instead. So, Mrs. Jones, no, of course not. You don't need to do anything if you don't want to. But here's what's happening. In these photos and x-rays, all the bleeding in your gums and the shrinking bone, that's what's causing your teeth to feel sore and loose. What I'm worried about is I see a lot of patients who wait too long and their infection gets so bad that it costs them all their teeth and they end up in dentures or implants. These patients spend anywhere from $10,000 to even $80,000 to get their teeth back. That's our anchor. The good news is that your gum infection isn't that bad yet. This is the key word, yet. At this point, you can still fix this. You don't need implants or dentures or any of your teeth removed. All it takes is a couple extra trips a year to see the hygienist so she can help you keep on top of cleaning the tough spots in your mouth where the infection lives. Does that sound like a reasonable plan? So this is a super simple and super clear framework to answer the question in a way that the patient understands. And when they understand, not only do they make better decisions, but they also feel more respected and they feel like you're talking to them like a person and that you're respecting their decisions. One last example just to show you the versatility of this 3-step framework. What about patients who say to you or your front desk on the phone or your dental assistant when you leave the room or your hygienist when they're in for their recall check, hey, how much do you guys charge for an implant? Now, I guarantee you, if you go right now and ask your hygienist or your front desk person who answers the phone what they would say if a patient says, hey, what do you charge for an implant? They'd probably say something like, I think it's something like $5,000 or $6,000, or if you need like really big sinus lift, it could be even like $8,000. If you need 2 teeth or a bridge, it could be like $10,000 or $15,000. Does that sound like a good idea? Would you like to schedule that appointment to see how much money this is going to cost you? That sounds like a horrible idea, that you've just delivered really bad news to the patient. So here's how you would use the 3-step framework to make that same information sound like great news. We would say something like, the cost depends on the situation. What's happening is your cost depends mostly on how much bone you have because you need bone to make sure your new tooth is strong. Super simple, super clear, in words that a 12-year-old would understand. There's no talk about osteoclast or bone density or sinus membranes. It's just very, very clear and simple. What I'm worried about is a lot of people don't have enough bone in this area of their mouth, which doesn't mean they can't get an implant. It just means they need bone grafting first. This is our anchor, which usually means a trip to the specialist, multiple surgeries over 12 months, and by the time you pay the specialist and pay us, you can easily spend in the $10,000 range. So we've anchored the patient to another outcome that's more expensive and less desirable. And we'll pause for a beat, let that sink in, and then we continue. The good news is that if you do have enough bone, then you can skip the bone grafting, skip the extra surgeries and the trips to the specialist, and Dr. X can do the whole thing for you right here in our office in about 4 months. And it will cost you just $5,000. Would you like to learn more about that? Now you can imagine if your hygienist said this to the patient in the chair and the patient said, yeah, actually I would like to learn more about that. I'm really hoping that Dr. X can do this without bone grafting. Imagine how that changes your consultation when that patient finally meets you, the doctor. Instead of you trying to convince the patient that they should get an implant or else they're going to lose bone, instead, they're coming to you hoping that they qualify for an implant with no bone grafting. And now all you have to do is be able to execute the case, and this case is closed. So to summarize, this 3-step framework can be used by any dentist, and in fact, we use it for all of our dentists and all of our staff to improve patient communication. The keys are that You don't have to go back and memorize these scripts. I just wrote them as examples to give you an idea of how we apply this framework to different situations in our office. The most important things to remember are, first of all, that the order of what you talk about matters. You have to start with, here's what's happening, what I'm worried about is, and then the good news, which is your preferred treatment solution. It's going to be natural. Our natural tendency is to start with our treatment first, and then to go back and explain all the reasons why you think this treatment is good. No, you got to do it the other way first. Here's what's happening, what I'm worried about is, or the anchor, and then the good news is, which is your preferred treatment. Secondly, the exact wording doesn't matter. You don't have to follow these scripts. It's much more important that whatever you say feels authentic to the patient and not robotic. But try this out with your patients. Let me know in the comments below if there's any clinical scenarios that you run across in your office where you're not sure how to apply this 3-step framework.